I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my pretend co-host, Brett.
I hope that's a pun, Alice. I hope you're not firing me. Are you firing me?
I'm not firing you, but I'm not going to lie. You're not the one I'm most excited to talk to today because we have the creator of the Pretend podcast, Javier Leiva, here with us today to talk about his podcast and the latest season that is taking the podcast and true crime world by storm. Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphreys? Javier, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Alice and Brett. This is a huge honor. I've heard so much about this show and your fans, by the way. Can I say that your fans, I've felt their presence. They have taken over my show. One of your listeners, she listened to my entire series and created a timeline. And it was just so cool.
The timeline was awesome too.
Yeah.
And we agree with you. We have the best listeners. And the fact that our listeners binged your show, and then you are probably one of the most requested interviews we've had. So there's synergies here. We're so excited to have you here. But we do agree with you that our listeners are amazing.
Definitely. And shout out to Jessica Sarlo, by the way. She's one of your listeners, and she was cool. I had her on my bonus episode. I don't know if you guys listened to that, but it's very cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first of all, Javier, before we dive into Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey, how did you get into this whole podcasting thing and sort of unveiling the truth behind people in the first place?
I have no fascination with con artists prior to this podcast. They never even crossed my mind, but I knew I wanted to do a podcast called Pretend. And it was originally about ghostwriters and comedians and actors, people who have to pretend to be someone else to perform. So it was like an artsy fartsy show. And then I went down to Miami for Christmas, and my cousin was getting ready to go to federal prison because he's the black sheep in the family. Everybody knew he was, did bad things, but nobody really knew exactly what he did. So I had this podcast and I'm like, hey, Eric, do you mind if I just record your life story? And he told me everything from the time that he was breaking into cars, breaking into houses, staging car insurance fraud, and then ultimately owning a medical clinic where he hired a real doctor to write opioid prescriptions. And that's how he got busted and went to federal prison. And my jaw was on the ground. I just couldn't believe the stories that he was telling me. And that's when I knew. I was like, this is what the show is about. People pretending to be someone else, con artists. And I was like, after that, I was like, I got to find more. And so the rest is history.
You have had so many seasons already. So was that your first idea to do something like that? And then how do you pick your seasons? Because they're all standalone stories, right?
Well, not all the time. So after I interviewed my cousin, I'm like, okay, I got to find more of these people. And so I found a cult, and I ultimately interviewed the cult leader, and then I just found a bunch of different people. And I think the first season, it was okay, oh, is this what my show's about? And I was kind of learning what the show was about. But it's always been very loose. I love the concept of pretend because you could pretend to be all kinds of things. I've had Donnie Brasco, the real Donnie Brasco, on my show because he was pretending, going deep undercover with the FBI. And that was pretending to be for good, right? So you don't always have to be a con artist. And I love how I could stretch that concept. Now, it just so happens that there are some seasons, like the LaDonna series, that take up 16 episodes like this one. And then I did one, Brett and I were just talking about it, the Frank Abagnale season. That was I don't even know, 18 episodes. And I did one on the stalker. So there are seasons where I go all in, but I like the variety. Because to me, that's what I do. The podcast for me, I tell people it's very selfish. I do it for me. And if you like it, that's cool. But these are the things that I find fascinating.
Yeah, the whole idea of the Frank Abagnale. I've got to listen to that season. I haven't listened to it yet. But
it's very good.
He's like a con man pretending to be a better con man than he actually is, which I guess worked out for him.
It's very meta. Yeah. He definitely is a con man, just not the con man that he leads people to believe.
So obviously Frank Abagnale there was a movie made about him. Right.
Yes.
So sort of
Right.
how you find yourself talking about that makes sense. And then cults are fascinating. And you talked about your cousin. Tonight, we're talking primarily about your current season, which just wrapped up, which is amazing. If you haven't listened to it, absolutely should.
Thank you.
LaDonna Humphrey. How did you come upon this person? How did she end up on your radar? And what made you decide this is something that I want to do?
Well, you and I and all of our fellow podcasting friends, it's just a small circle. Like we all kind of know each other, you know, but funny enough, I never even heard of LaDonna Humphrey. I should have, because after doing the series, I realized that a lot of my friends who are podcasters have either dealt with her, interacted with her, or, you know, had bad experiences with her. And it turns out that, yeah, I should have known who she was, but I didn't. And so when Anthony Christopher, who's her former employer, he reached out to me and he told me his story, but he also told me everybody's stories. And sometimes, you know, it was just like, what? I had a hard time understanding the story because and you guys know after listening to the series, it's very hard to describe the series. There's no elevator pitch at all. But it wasn't until I met another one of her alleged victims, Alicia Lockhart, who, when I met with her, I had no idea what I was going to talk to her about. I was just like, tell me your story. And she told me that she did this death fetish video for this director, and then LaDonna Humphrey, she teamed up with her trying to find this death fetish director. And it turns out that LaDonna Humphrey was the one tormenting her, like acting like the death fetish director. It blew my mind. I was like, wow, okay, this story is like a spider. It just kind of goes everywhere.
Just to be clear,
I realized,
Alicia Lockhart was her podcast host, co-host. It would be like me doing this to Alice, basically.
And co-author.
Of a book.
Right.
It's exactly that. Imagine, Brett, that Alice was just messing with you. She created all these spoof emails and phone numbers and was just tormenting you to create content for the prosecutor's podcast. That's exactly what happened.
And can I just say, for anyone who hasn't listened, the very first episode starts with Alicia's story, and it starts with clown death fetish videos, and you don't ever hear LaDonna's name. And I will say, keep listening, because I started listening and I texted Brett and I was like, did I hit the right podcast? Which goes to your point, because I am going to force you to do a little bit of an elevator pitch in case anyone's listening who's never heard of this season, because I want them to kind of get a concept of this, because as soon as they get it, they're going to go run to your podcast to listen, is the spider web. Exactly what you said. Every turn is a little bit of a whiplash, because you can't imagine the number of turns that are unpredictable in your season. So can you give like that little elevator pitch, if you could, of what this season is?
Yeah, I've had a hard time describing and distilling this to an elevator pitch. But when I tell people who don't know about the story, I say, this is a very well-known true crime podcaster, author, speaker, somebody who has a very polished image in the true crime world, who is accused of creating the harassment that is basically the stories that she's reporting on. It's a lot like that Jake Gyllenhaal movie. I forget what it's called, where he's the reporter and also the killer. You know, he's creating the stories. Yeah, the Night Stalker. I think that's what it's called. Night Stalker. But that's just like one part of the story, like Alice was saying, because the other part of the story, the other elevator pitch is, this is a woman who runs a sober living facility. It's a nonprofit, and she runs this organization accepting donations, and she has not been tax exempt for 8 years. Where's this donation money going? And so there's so many facets to the story that I think are fascinating. And I think your listeners, I mean, we're spoiling it a little bit here, but there's no way. I mean, your jaw will drop every single episode.
And the other thing, just in case your interest hasn't been piqued, the thing that I thought your storytelling was so good is that you bring out the impact that we all know, kind of crazy people in our lives who tell tall tales, who live kind of dramatic lives. But here, police are involved, real charges are brought. Police are involved all throughout the case, you know, in all different aspects, whether, you know, investigating her or she's on the reporting side, to real people who are near kind of the edge of life. And she is kind of responsible for trying to push them over that edge, especially when we're talking about this true crime world. And not to mention, of course, she is very well known in the true crime world because she hosts a true crime festival as well.
A true crime festival.
Which was called off, I don't think in small part because of probably what you were reporting on. and I know
Officially, it's a scheduling conflict. All right. Yeah.
it
And
got
those people
scheduled
who
right at
have
the time
bought,
it was being exposed.
right. Yeah. Coincidentally, the podcast exposing her came out at the same time. And those people that have bought tickets have not been reimbursed, by the way. So TBD.
So let me start with a question that maybe, so anyone who hasn't listened to this, the title of your show is someone who is active in the true crime world, she's not someone that most people would have heard of, like Frank Abagnale.
Right. Not
There's
a
a movie about
household
him.
name. Right.
Right, not a household name. And so I know that some people may ask, wait, why are you focusing on one person? Is it fair to go after one person? Can you tell us why, when you heard this elevator pitch and you're thinking, I don't really get it, why would I do a whole season on this? What ultimately led you to do it and why you stuck with it and why it's important you've done this season?
There are many answers to that question. First of all, Frank Abagnale was an anomaly. He's the most well-known person I've covered, but almost as a general rule, I like covering cases that most people haven't heard of. And the reason is because I like to break new ground. I like it to be interesting. So that's one reason. Another reason is that this person has been running under the radar like for 30 years, doing this kind of stuff. Like nobody's held her accountable for any of this stuff. And what a lot of my listeners don't realize is that before I hit publish on a podcast, there was a case that it took me 2 years to research before I ever published it. And after I published it, a grand jury met 3 days later after I published it and arrested the subjects of my show and charged them with 6 felonies. So 2 years it took me to do that. With the LaDonna series, I did a lot of research and I did a lot of interviews before I ever published it. So by the time I published it, I felt very confident that was my responsibility at that point because no one had touched the story, either because they were afraid, hence the title of the show, or just it's easier to ignore. I spoke with Julia Cali, who the FBI agent. I think she's part of your network. She said, yeah, when the FBI is looking at a case, they're not really concerned about somebody who's taking a couple $1,000s here and there. They're looking for big fraud, right? So there's this like altitude that I'm covering that I think is equally as important. Real people's lives are at stake, and it's just not getting media attention, and it's not getting the attention from law enforcement and the judicial system.
And I'm really glad you brought that up because you see some people, obviously they're critics of your show, and we'll talk about some of the criticisms.
Yeah.
And one of them is, it's almost like people now feel sorry for LaDonna. It's like, why would you do this? She's nobody. You're spending 16 episodes. You've now read information all over the world, whatever.
Yeah.
But I think something you pointed out is really important. There is sort of this middle space between like easy to prosecute, low level fraud type stuff that the local cops handle all the time, and the big stuff that you see the federal officials go after. And then there's a sort of middle ground, a sort of low level, mid-level harassment and maybe doing some bad things or whatever that really does just go uninvestigated, unpunished, and undiscussed. And it can really hurt a lot of people. And I feel like it seems like you're kind of filling that gap that maybe has not been filled before.
Yeah, that's the way I see it. I mean, I feel like I'm giving a voice to these people that have been either ignored or too afraid to speak up. And actually, it's been a little moving seeing all these people come together and really sticking their necks out, especially some of the women that are living in a sober living facility. Literally, the roof above their head is at stake. They could go to jail because of this, because of speaking out about this. So a lot of people have been very brave. And for me as a journalist, it's been very moving to see this movement happen.
I mean, I don't think this gives anything away, but I think it was your last episode really did bring tears to my eyes because there's a woman living at the sober center who says that a friend put an earbud in her ear to listen to your podcast report about something that she thought was going on, but she had no proof of. And she suddenly realized kind of just how precarious her life was and had to get out. And I mean, talk about, we don't always get to see the effects of our work right away. I mean, and that was literally, you were affecting change in real time. And I would say she's probably the lucky one because she had
Yeah.
an opportunity to escape. But kind of along those lines, like you said, you've talked to so many people, including, by the way, the subject of the podcast. So how many alleged victims, if you even know the number, did you speak to in making this one? And then, I don't want to get ahead, but I'd love you to talk about how you got connected with LaDonna Humphrey, and you do speak with her and she spoke with
Yeah.
you.
I haven't tallied it up, but I would say it's like in the 20s area because like if you just include the sober living facility, I mean, it grows exponentially, the list, right? There are like the core group that has organized against her, but I mean, there are a lot of people, a lot of well-known cases, even the Maura Murray family, there's a lot of true crime cases that are pretty famous cases that LaDonna has embedded herself in, and there's accusations of her embezzling money out of these organizations. And I'd be curious to tally it up, actually. Yeah. Now that it's all said and done, I would love to tally how many victims. And then the second part of your question was, how did I get LaDonna on my show? Like, how do you convince LaDonna to be on Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey? Well, the trick is don't tell her that the title of the show. But I texted LaDonna, and this is what she criticizes me about a lot. I texted her and I said, hey, would you like to be on my show, Criminal Conduct? At the time, honestly, the show could have gone to either of my podcasts. I have another show called Criminal Conduct, which is more of a long form true crime show. And I like to keep the episodic episodes on Pretend. So yeah, at one point I was considering putting her on there. And she goes, is it about the Missy Witt case? And I go, yeah, I want to talk about that too. And she just assumed that that's all we were going to talk about and that it was going to be another puff piece on her. And pretty soon, I think 2 or 3 questions in, she realized, oh no, this is not going to be a puff piece show. But funny enough, she actually let me, I had 6 pages or something of questions and she let me ask every single question. She took it like a champ for sure.
Which, to her credit, she didn't just hang up on you. I mean, she answered the questions. And what's interesting about this, I feel like there's probably people out there who have not listened to the show and are lost. And it's easy to get lost because there's so many different, it's like an octopus, right? There's so many different tentacles to this. As Javier pointed out, LaDonna Humphrey is someone to paint her in the best light, someone in her community who's very involved in foster care, someone who runs a sober living facility, someone who I would say is probably the most prominent investigator into the Missy Witt case, which is a true crime case out of Arkansas, where she lives, the host of a true crime festival in Arkansas, someone who has been to CrimeCon many times, the author of true crime books, particularly about Missy Witt's case, the co-host of a podcast with Alicia Lockhart, at least previously, who may have had some tangential connection to Missy Witt, if you believe her. So this is somebody who is doing all these sort of things, and your investigation kind of touches on all those different aspects and whether or not she's acting appropriately in all those. And I do want to ask you this. We've talked about the victims. There are a lot of them. That's a loaded word, victim, because what some people would say is they're not victims. They're aggrieved parties. So you've got a gentleman who she worked for who fired her after 30 days, something like 6 weeks, something like that.
Or before the 90-day probation period or something.
Yeah, who she was later involved in a lawsuit in, who eventually got her sent to jail circuitously, and who was briefly, at least, indicted for Medicare fraud. Then you have the pastor and the family of a church that she worked for that may or may not have been engaged in IRS fraud, that may or may not have burned down their own house, and who may or may not, if you listen to LaDonna Humphrey, have engaged in some sort of inappropriate sexual conduct. You have Alicia Lockhart, who has told this story, but according to LaDonna, she doesn't necessarily believe the story, and that's really where their rift started when she started to question the story. Anyways, there are 2 sides to every story, and everyone who comes on your show, even the Maura Murray family, you could argue they're upset because LaDonna lifted the veil on their attempts to cover up what really happened to Maura. There's that perspective, and you see that sort of in the critics of the show. They're saying, look, you've just trusted these people who come forward with some sort of grudge against LaDonna Humphrey, and they're telling you how awful she is, and you just ran with it. What do you say to people who levy that criticism?
I think those people didn't listen to the podcast because, with every one of those accusations, I'm backing it up with LaDonna's own voice, right? So we hear her in her own voice talking about these things. So it's not like subjective or conjecture. You know, like this is her talking about these things. Do the people who are speaking out against her have an axe to grind? Absolutely. Yeah, they're pissed, right? And no doubt everyone who has come on my show, even beyond this series, has some sort of agenda. Everyone. And I'm very well aware of that, because if you come on my show, that's the first thing I'm looking at. It's like, how are you trying to use me or manipulate my show to get your agenda out? And then I do my best to navigate around that. But I find that I've covered my tracks, right? Like I made sure that I did my homework. I pulled the proper documents. You know, if it's speculation, I made sure to label it that way. But if it's factual, I'm reading text messages, voice. I mean, like, I feel like I brought the goods. So anyone who has those accusations has not listened to the show. And I hope that I never came across as saying that these people are, you know, don't have an axe to grind, because they do. And that's okay. I mean, everybody does in a conflict, right?
Kind of along those lines, whenever you investigate something, there could be things that you choose not to report on. And obviously, if you chose not to put it in your podcast, there might be a reason that you can't talk about it here. But Did that happen in this instance? And you're right. Throughout your podcast, you do say, I have the screenshots here. I'm reading them. You know, I'm quoting her here, versus now I couldn't follow up on this because there are no screenshots, there are no voice memos, and you make it very clear throughout the podcast. But was there anything that came across, you know, your journalistic desk and you're like, there's not enough to report on it here, and how you chose to do that?
Yeah, when I first got this story, she was like responsible for multiple arsons. I mean, this woman, like, if you crossed her, she would burn down your house. I mean, like, instantly. I mean, that's the kind, you know, everybody comes at you with this like big picture. And then when you start drilling into it, you realize, oh, you know, maybe it wasn't that, or maybe that's just a coincidence, but that's not enough for me to go on. Right. And so a lot of those stories just get thrown to the side. I think the only exception that I made was when I interviewed her sister, who, by the way, I mean, how bad do you have to be for your own sister? I mean, I don't care how bad my brother is. I would never go on a podcast to badmouth my sister. But
that whole baby story, by the way, the baby story, and then the sister and the OD story. I mean, all that was just.
And the hotel room. Oh.
Right. And that almost didn't make it on the podcast, because going back to what Alice was saying, I have no evidence to support it. Any of that. But, you know, I think that was like episode 5 or something like that. By that point, you know, even though I had no evidence, I had evidence for a lot of stuff. And that story seemed to match the same kind of MO as the other story. So I felt it was relevant. Like, leaving it out would be leaving out a big part of the psychology behind this person. And this is all that I'm doing. It's a big case study on like the psychology of like what motivates this woman to do what she's accused of doing.
And that was one of the instances that I remember vividly where you said, I can't further back this up. But what I found really compelling is you didn't stop there, because you specifically asked very pointed questions about what was being alleged to LaDonna, and she got to respond. And that in and itself, like, whoever is lying or not lying, both parties were asked basically the exact same questions, and you could hear their answers. And this is what we say happens in the court of law, why juries have to listen to a witness and they get to assess for themselves. And you kind of present it that way, where it's like you're hearing two sides of the exact same story and they're telling different stories, and you as the listener get to assess whether you want to believe one or the other. So I give you a lot of credit there, because those are some hard, I can imagine those were a lot of hard questions to ask her.
Well, and in that case, her sister was not in a good state of mind. I mean, she had drug addiction problems, and the stuff that her sister was telling me, she actually didn't even remember. I remember after I spoke with LaDonna's husband texted me right afterwards with evidence of that. Hey, no, we picked her up. We took her to this place. That was evidence. And I was like, good, thank you. You cleared it up. You know, so it's not like, I know it seems very one-sided, and it is. It's a very one-sided story, because at some point in the story, I became I don't want to throw the victim word, but I started to feel the same effects of the harassment that these people were talking about. It's one thing to report on this stuff and not having experienced it myself, but I'm experiencing it. It's almost like if you're being accused of harassment, don't harass the person that's reporting
So
on it.
go into that.
You're
The
just
people
proving
who
my point.
So people
Yeah.
may not know what you're talking about. Okay, so at some point, podcast reporting life becomes your real life. Can you tell
Right.
people what you're talking about there?
Yes. And so this has been I've done 18 seasons, 7 years of this. I've worked in local news prior to this. I've never in my entire career have experienced what I've experienced now. From even before the podcast dropped, after I interviewed LaDonna, I started getting spoof emails. I started getting text messages, but that's just the beginning. LaDonna, I can't even remember because it's like, I try to block it out, but LaDonna she filed the trademark Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey, so that Apple gave me 5 days to resolve this matter with this woman who obviously does not like what I'm doing. And they gave me 5 days to resolve it with her, or they would take down my entire show. And so I hired an IP attorney. I filed for the trademark Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey. And I have common law trademark. I'm going to own that. That's the dumbest thing I've ever owned in my life, but I saved the show, right? And they took out a URL that sounds a lot like my show that redirects to a podcast that they started. The whole point of this podcast is not just a rebuttal podcast, but it's a platform to humiliate and further harass the people who are saying they're victims of her. There's this online blog that sounds like I'm not even going to mention the blog's name because I don't want to give them traffic. An online blog from Fort Smith that sounds legit, publishing blog articles about me, my past, all the victims' past, and just this is all on behalf of LaDonna. So she herself, like, she's still trying to preserve her pristine true crime author, appearance, but she's using all these other mediums to attack me and all the other victims. So in a way, I kind of inadvertently became part of the story, but I'm feeling it, right? Like every day I'm getting harassment. Like just today, just a couple hours ago, they released another harassment podcast episode. And it just never ends.
It's wild that somebody would do a podcast just to criticize you for something.
It's actually kind of flattering.
I can't really imagine that happening. The other thing that you did, the text messages. So one of the sort of allegations about LaDonna is that she uses text messages and emails and spoof accounts to send sort of harassing messages. Right as you were starting, did you start to receive some similar type messages?
Before I even published the podcast, I got emails. Like, who else would have done that? Like,
but at that point, how did she know about the podcast?
Because after I interviewed her and before I actually published the episodes, that's when the harassment started.
I gotcha. When she realized what the questions were.
Doesn't make a lot of sense, right?
Yeah. What was that? I mean, not a great way to cover your tracks.
I mean, I'm not like, IT expert, but, or Sherlock Holmes, but it sounds like.
So selfishly, I want to talk a little bit about the Maura Murray thing.
Yeah.
So Maura Murray, for those of you who don't know, somehow missed it. One of the first cases we covered, young lady, she's going to school in Amherst, Massachusetts, at UMass, nursing school, one of the best nursing schools in the country. And one day she loads up in her very unreliable vehicle, drives to New Hampshire, vanishes without a trace. They find her car. Some people see her. It looks like she's had a small wreck. She tells them she's fine. She's called AAA, which is impossible because she didn't have cell service. And then she's gone. And there's no trace ever found of her. And it's a case that sort of was bubbling in true crime for a long time. James Renner, who, in full disclosure, fan of the show, friend of James Renner. I like James Renner. Don't always agree with James. James and I argue about things on occasion, but I do like him. He wrote a book about the case. It kind of blew up the case. But in the book, he's very critical of the family and some of the things the family did. And this book came out in 2015, 2016. I remember reading it around that time. So then, bizarrely, and this was the episode where I was listening to you, where I literally sat down on my floor and listened to it because I was so shocked by the whole thing. A story comes out. James reports on a story that he receives information that there had been a reward for information leading to Maura all the way back in 2006. Is that right?
Something like that. Yeah, I would have to check my notes.
And now, some 11 years later, I think this is in 2017, he receives information that while that reward was out, that the family had been so protective of the information, particularly Mara's father, that he wanted to see every single tip that came in before it went to anybody, before anybody else read it, before it went to the police, anything. Right. He wanted to see the tips. Obviously, if that's true, that's damning. I mean, that's a bad fact, right? And that information apparently came from LaDonna Humphrey. And so my question for you is, number one, tell me a little bit about how you found out about that. But number two, and this is the impossible question, but I'm going to ask you anyways. Sure. Why? Why would she do that more than a decade after the events of the whole tip reward fiasco?
All right. So in full disclosure, you probably know more about the Maura Murray case than I do, because like I said earlier, this case was like a spider web. It was hard to drill deep into every single aspect of the story. And so this is one of those where I know the story at a surface level, where the way you described it. But one thing I do know is that I've seen the actual emails. I've seen the tips that came in, okay, which weren't much. And it is clear as day that email was fabricated. It was just like, it was doctored in a way that is very easy to detect. I mean, if you see the original email and then you see the doctored email, you know what happened. But the thing that gets me is the why. Like, why would she do this 10 years later? Why would she set up a reward and nothing happens, and then 10 years later, she comes up with this email? And to me, that's a very easy question to answer, is because you have somebody who's very ambitious. She wants to be part of the conversation. And she tried it one way by setting a reward, and she did not reap the fame that she was seeking. And so 10 years go by. James Renner is very critical of this family. She's like, I'm going to ride that wave instead. And then that happens. And this is the type of person that LaDonna is. She's just very short-sighted, very myopic. She's just looking for opportunities, very similar to the other con artists that I cover on my show. They're very opportunistic, and she sees an opportunity. Let's ride the James Renner wave. And that's what she did. It's not deeper than that. Like, there's no like conspiracy. That's what she did. She saw that James Renner was getting traction. She wanted in on the action.
Let me ask you this, because this is one thing I wasn't clear on. Did we know at the time in 2017 that she was the whistleblower? Does that make sense? Did we know that in 2017, or is that new information that only recently came out?
I did not follow it at the time, but I'm pretty sure that Julie Murray knew that at the time. Yeah, that's when it all came out, like 10 years after the reward money expired. There was no hiccup. If there was a real concern, like if LaDonna was holding on to this bomb, right? Why would she hold on to it for 10 years? Why not say something sooner?
That's a great question, because you would think that would be something you'd want the authorities to know.
Yeah.
If that were true.
It's very odd, the timing of things,
And so we're going to ask a lot of why questions that I don't think have answers to.
I love this, by the way. You guys are like, this is a good interview.
Oh, thanks. So what was blowing my mind the whole time is you can imagine why someone would do these things. Like you said, ride that wave for either attention or financial gain in a very, very popular true crime case. And obviously she's already a big figure in the true crime world. What really blows my mind is that true crime isn't her only profession. It is a big part of her profession, but as you report and as we've alluded to, she also has actually multiple facets of her life. She's a foster mother, and she runs a alleged nonprofit that actually is not really a nonprofit because it doesn't have the proper papers to be tax exempt, but a sober living center. And so it's like there are all these different parts, and you can almost imagine someone who goes through all of these hoops and all of these, lies to manipulate the field in which they're in. But it's so interesting that she's doing this in not even like her only profession. I mean, do you have some deeper insight, having spent so much time with trying to understand what makes her do these things? Factor underneath all of it, what is it?
The motivation is the same. So the motivation for her true crime aspirations and her motivation for her faux profit, faux as in fake profit.
I got it. That was good.
Yeah, the motivation is the same. It's she wants to look like the hero. If you Google the Oasis of Northwest Arkansas page and see how many times they mention LaDonna and how great she is, okay? And then try to find out information of what services they actually offer the women. It's like more like LaDonna puff piece and less about the women that they're trying to help. So when I look at her aspirations for true crime and the sober living facility, it's just the same. Attention. LaDonna needs to look like the hero. LaDonna needs to be the star. In fact, the last line for the last episode, I hate to spoil it for you, is that it's a voice memo that she says, true crime is what I want my career to be. It's all I've ever wanted, and I will stop at nothing to be successful. Or I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that I saved that soundbite for the last episode because it really just summed it up. Every episode, even though we described this story, and your listeners who haven't listened to this are like, what the hell are these people talking about? Everything comes back to this need for attention, this need for fame. And anyone who's in her way just gets run over. It doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
So let's talk about Oasis, because this is another one. I feel like I'm putting on my devil's hat, being the devil's advocate here.
Love it.
Oasis is one that I think the 2 or 3 episodes that you did on Oasis, probably number one, were mind-blowing to more people than anything else you did, but also divisive in a way where some people were completely with you and some people were very critical. And I think one of the criticisms people said that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is a lot of the women in Oasis are addicts. And addicts, number one, lie to you all the time. Nobody will lie to you more than an addict, right? And number two, they need structure. They're there. A lot of them are there under court order. The court expects there to be a lot of structure, a lot of control. It's kind of like, not to cite one of the worst legal movies ever, but if you've ever seen Double Jeopardy with Tommy Lee Jones as the probation officer, and he runs sort of a halfway house, and he's just hardcore on these ladies. And he's like, if you mess up, you're going back to jail. You're going back to prison. And his approach is you have to be that way if you're going to sort of transition these people from prison into real life. And if you're not hard on them, they'll take advantage of you. So that was a criticism. Look, everything LaDonna did, the strict rules, calling her ma'am, you got to be the curfew, the don't break things, all that stuff actually isn't that unusual kind of thing you might see at any of these types of houses. Number one, is that true? And number two, what do you say to that criticism?
I don't disagree at all. I don't disagree. First of all, I never disagreed. And then I got reinforcement from people who have either managed other sober living facilities or have been at other sober living facilities or transitional homes that you have to have rules. It has to be strict. There was an anecdote in my series where a kid left a spoon on the table or a sandwich on the table. I forget. It was something that to you and I.
He left out a sandwich, I think, because his mom lived there.
It should be no big deal, right? Like you leave a sandwich on the table. Yeah, that's annoying. But actually, these are very strict rules. And somebody told me that in their sober living facility, that would have been a reason for discipline too, because you have to have order, right? You're not just dealing with one person, you're dealing with like 20 people. So I don't disagree with that at all. I think LaDonna needs to rule like a very tight ship. No disagreement there. But the things that come into question is, why is she tracking their location, especially when they're not court ordered or on probation or anything? Why is she tracking the locations of the managers who work there? That makes no sense. These are people that are not even part of the program anymore. They're just working there. They're not even getting paid. Their payment is a roof over their head. Explain that to me. I don't understand why you would need to track somebody's location who's not part of a court-ordered program. And there were just things like that that made no sense. To me, if you solicit donations from, I spoke to a company down in Arkansas, like a very Christian, very wholesome company. They donated $10,000 to support this sober living facility for the sole purpose of getting a vehicle. Okay. And this sober living facility never gets a vehicle, but LaDonna got a new vehicle, a new personal vehicle. So I think there's a distinction, and I don't think I've ever shied away from the fact that it needs to be run like a tight ship, but there has to be a limit to that, right? I mean, it becomes borderline abusive and criminal when there's money being siphoned out, when people's every move is tracked and they're being emotionally and psychologically abused. I think there's a line there. for sure.
And that's really helpful to hear in the sense that you talked at the beginning about this gray area, right? It's almost kind of hard to point to exactly because you can point to a lot of it being structure that all sober living facilities need. And in fact, court orders usually want certain things. But when you start talking about embezzlement or mishandling of money, and then the other part that I thought stood out was the lack of services, right? These are vulnerable women. They're coming from difficult situations, and whether they're court ordered to be there or they choose to be there, yes, it is a roof over their heads. But a lot of these facilities, Brett and I know, we work with them through the different types of cases. Our defendants typically have something like a support group or counselors or something like that.
Right.
And that was something that you had pointed out, that there were no such services offered at all. And that's even more concerning when there are fundraisers to benefit the sober living facility without kind of any, benefits coming from it.
Yeah. And I think that, if she has a spoof account on Reddit, there's a subreddit for this podcast, and it's called the Truth Seeker. And the Truth Seeker account, which is obviously LaDonna, pointed out, well, Oasis is just a low, cheap residential housing. And I'm like, okay, well, if that's it, then that's fine. But don't call it a sober living facility. I mean, these women are at the lowest point of their lives. They're trying to rebuild their lives and get out and maybe get their kids back or not go back to jail and stay off of drugs. To add constant abuse and extortion, like if somebody dings a donated table that they didn't even pay for, she's texting the whole house saying, each of you owe me $20. And this one girl's like, I only have $40 in my account and I didn't do this. And then she's out. She kicks her out. I mean, I don't know. I've never run a sober living facility, but that doesn't seem right.
And kicking her out in a lot of instances doesn't mean now you got to go find somewhere else. It means now you got to go to jail because you're required to be there.
Right.
And one of the other things, that blew my mind was the forcing women who are struggling with addiction to serve alcohol at a concert venue. And Donna, in one of the messages, like, now, if you have any concerns about this, you don't have to do it. It's like, wait a second. They have to do this to pay their rent. They don't have any money. They don't have any other source of income. This is the way they get to stay there. And you're telling them, oh, you don't have to do this if you're worried about this. I mean, as if that was a real choice. I mean, talk about like a Hobson's choice. It's like you either take the horse or go without a ride. I mean, basically.
Yeah. You don't have to do this, but you'll be homeless or go to jail. It's terrible. And then also I question the corporations, like Walmart Amphitheater is obviously, has a Walmart name behind it, but they're paying the LaDonna and Oasis a lot of money per concert to have these women work at this event. And these women are only getting 1 week's worth of rent paid. And sometimes they're working every event. I mean, it almost seems like,
which is
labor.
what, like $135, something like that?
Yeah.
And then we're not talking about
is one way to describe it.
Yeah. What's happening with the rest of that money? Where is that money going? I mean, if some, like a prosecutor, and I would love to hear your opinion on this, if a prosecutor subpoenaed their bank records, I mean, there just seems to be a lot of money coming in and not a lot of money coming out. It's just like, that's where I would look if I were a prosecutor.
Well, speaking of that, do you know, are there any sort of, I mean, you've raised a lot of concerns, a lot of issues, and look, they may all be baseless. You might look at those books and they might be perfectly kept and everything makes sense. And you're like, oh shoot, you guys are barely making it, great job budgeting as well as you have. Are there any sort of ongoing investigations into any of these questions that you've raised?
Yeah, it actually seems like there is something brewing in the background. I've heard that not only, the county is looking into it, like conducting a serious investigation, but I mean, we've made the Attorney General aware of the situation. I think my listeners have almost annoyed the crap out of the AG's office, but so they are aware of the situation and they said that they would look into it. I don't know officially, they can't tell us whether an investigation is happening, but they sure were interested in getting a lot of the evidence. I've heard recently, this is like late breaking news. This did not make it on the podcast. One of the former resident managers told me that Oasis had an occupancy of roughly 19 women. They're down to like 10 or 8 women. So that tells me that something's happening. This is a place that had a backlog, okay? Because it's a much needed thing in the community. I am, as a journalist, I'm not trying to take down this sober living facility. All I'm trying to do is exactly what you said, Brett, which is, hey, somebody look into this. Are the books adding up? Is the occupancy concern, is it good? I contacted the Bella Vista, city of Bella Vista to look into the ordinance to make sure, because one of the complaints is that this woman was sleeping with her 3 kids on a twin mattress with 3 other women in one room. I mean, like, these concerns are very valid, and they are looking into it. And I've heard that even the courts are asking questions, and the probation officers are asking questions like, what's going on there? So if my job was to raise awareness and get people to pay attention, I think I succeeded in that point.
I mean, along those lines, now that, you've kind of finished this season, what was your purpose in looking into this particular person for this season? And did it change as your season went on? And what do you hope comes from it?
Yeah, well, I wasn't planning on doing this season, so it kind of fell on my lap. And I'm glad I did take it. I'm glad I didn't turn it down because, like you said, Alice, this totally changed. Like, I had no idea that this was going to turn into a series about running a nonprofit, like, sober living facility. I had no idea about that when I got into this. So I was learning. At one point, I think I had like 5 episodes planned. And then at a certain point, the podcast just took a life of its own. And I'm just like, all right, Jesus, take the wheel. We're just going to see where this goes. And I've just been kind of letting the story go wherever it takes me. And I mean, I'm still kind of working on, even though it's done, I'm still working on it in the background. I'm producing an episode, like a couple episodes on it now for Patreon, because I don't want to bore people to death with it. I don't want to beat a dead horse. Like I think you guys alluded, like, come on, like, move on. But I'm still interested in the case. It's still very much alive. And so I feel like I need to see it through,
Well, we have a lot of friends in law enforcement in Arkansas, and I've told all of them to listen to your podcast. So
Yep.
There may or may not be people in the AG's office listening to your podcast, and who can say for sure. So I want to talk about Missy Witt for a second.
Yeah.
Because Missy Witt, and this is a true crime podcast, and Missy Witt is a big true crime case. So LaDonna has been very involved in it. There's one specific question I have, and then one general question I have. Number one, my specific question. You raised this. This begins the very first episode. We start talking about this Mickey Mouse watch. Mm-hmm. Is the Mickey Mouse watch a real thing? Did Missy Witt really have one of those, and was it really missing? Or was that a complete fabrication? That's my first question. And number two, in your opinion, based on what you're seeing, do you think LaDonna truly believes the narrative that she has presented on Missy Witt or not?
To answer your first question, the Mickey Mouse watch is a real thing. Okay. Missy Witt, I've spoken with childhood friends of her that confirmed, yeah, she had a Mickey Mouse watch, and so did every other girl in the 90s, right? Like, it's not a big deal. But if you think about this story, sounds so fascinating. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's this girl in Arkansas. She's supposed to go to a bowling alley. She disappears. They can't find her. All of a sudden, they find her naked body in the Ozark Mountains, and she's been strangled to death. Okay. But those are the facts of the case. Now, where it becomes storytelling is when LaDonna injects herself into the narrative, because yes, Missy Witt did have a Mickey Mouse watch. Yes, that Mickey Mouse watch was missing when they found their body, but so was every article of clothing and jewelry that was on her body. Like, why the Mickey Mouse watch? You know why she focused on the Mickey Mouse watch? Because it's a great plot device. If I were writing a movie or a book of fiction, that's a great narrative device. Oh, her Mickey Mouse watch was missing. That must mean something. Yeah, but so were her shoes and her earrings and everything else. So, like, why put so much importance on one piece of jewelry? It made no sense to me. I mean, at first it sounded really intriguing, but then when you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, she was just using that to hook us. I mean, that sounds like a headline, doesn't it?
And there's one thing that I want to point out, because there were so many times. I mean, look, maybe Javier doesn't know what he's doing. He got all this wrong, and LaDonna Humphrey is a completely above board, innocent person who's been whatever's happened to her. But there is one fact that just blew my mind. And I want you to just make sure that I heard this correctly, because I have to have you confirm this, because you said it several times, but I just want to make sure it's true.
Yeah.
Missy Witt, a victim of a murder, murdered brutally, her body dumped in a wilderness.
Right.
There was a video taken of the discovery of her body by law enforcement. My understanding, and I want you to confirm this, is that LaDonna Humphrey got a hold of that video and put it on YouTube. Now, put it on YouTube with a private link,
Right.
but that just means anyone in the world who has that link could post the link, and anyone in the world who has that link could view the video of this victim in this state. Am I right about that, or did I mishear you?
You got it 100% right. She, for some reason, the Fort Smith Police Department entrusted her with this video to digitize it because it was taken in the 90s. So, it was probably tape and it needed to be digitized so that they could look at it. But instead of, putting it on Dropbox or something like that, she puts it on YouTube as a private link. And what do you think is going to happen when you put it on YouTube and send it to people? People are going to send it to other people. Even as grotesque and disturbing as that video is, I mean, that's not the most secure way to share a piece of evidence in an open investigation.
That's actually the least secure way.
I was going to say there's
literally
not much
posting it publicly on
Right,
YouTube is the least secure way to do it.
But if we just let your audience think that, oh, well, she's an idiot, who would do that? There was a reason why. And it goes back to the main theme of the show, which is her need for attention. She got a hold of this video and she produced a documentary about the Melissa Witt case. And guess what? There are scenes of the crime scene footage in her documentary. So it's all self-serving, Now, in all fairness, the Hulu documentary that just came out also used portions of the crime scene video, but it felt different. It felt like it wasn't trying to exploit Missy Witt, which LaDonna Humphrey has had a track record of exploiting that case for her own personal fame.
And you, if I remember correctly, you spoke to Fort Smith police who did not intend to give her own access to it. So when a documentary uses footage, there's a lot of legal hoops they have to jump through, but they were surprised she had access to it, right?
Well, and the new administration was surprised. They're like blaming it on the previous administration. But yeah, there was a detective there that gave her carte blanche access to the evidence, to the diary, to all these things. And it wouldn't be so bad because LaDonna Humphrey got a private investigator license, and it wouldn't be so bad if she was legitimately trying to help the investigation. But I have screenshots of her sharing it with people that are not supposed to have this evidence, like, oh, look what I have, and she's sending it to people on Facebook Messenger. That's not a serious investigator, right? That's not how you handle sensitive evidence. I'm talking about like
we don't communicate with
stuff.
our federal agents through Facebook Messenger.
Right. That's not a legit, and you don't upload stuff to YouTube. No, that's ridiculous.
No, definitely not. I literally could talk to you all night, but I recognize we're closing in on the hour. And those of you who are listening, we've barely touched the tip of the iceberg of this season.
Barely.
If you haven't listened, it is a fast listen because you can't stop. You have got to go check out the Pretend podcast for all the seasons. But of course, today we've been talking about the latest season with Javier Leiva. But Javier, is there anything you want to say about this particular season that we haven't asked you about yet?
No, I think you asked such awesome questions. It really challenged the reporting, and I love that. I don't know. I just thank you so much for challenging the story because I feel like the reporting is solid, and I welcome this kind of criticism, right? Like poke holes at it. And I don't think I did a perfect job, right? And so that's why I'm asking if there are other podcasters listening to this or reporters or anybody that finds a story interesting that feels like they could take the baton and take it away. I don't think LaDonna Humphrey is a private citizen. I think she put herself out there as this public figure, and with that comes a lot of responsibility. And I think that as long as the story is alive, then the people who have suffered, because of her, they get justice, right? So like, feel free, anyone who's listening, to take the story, even though I ended the series.
I'll ask you one more hard question since you like hard questions. Because this came up on our Facebook page. So I'll go ahead and throw it out to you. You have a journalist just dream of private messages. You got text messages, voicemails. You got all sorts of stuff that she sent to her friends, stuff that she sent to the Oasis people. You just have tons of stuff. As you said, most of the story is told in her own voice. Is there, in your opinion, any sort of ethical problem with using these sort of private messages between her and maybe people who used to be her friends who are now opposed to her as part of your reporting?
Yeah, that was a question I was trying to remember. And I'm so glad you remembered to ask me, because that was a very critical moment where I had to decide, wait, what do I do with this? I have all these voice memos. This woman would just, instead of typing, she would record all these crazy things. And the people who are speaking out against her, they saved this stuff. It's still in their inbox, right? And so they dumped this on me, and I'm thinking, what do I do with it? Honestly, I don't think this series would have been as riveting or as compelling if it wasn't for the fact that you heard LaDonna Humphrey, in her own words, say the things that she said, because I think that's what makes this season so compelling and so ironclad, in my opinion. But at the same time, from a legal perspective, everybody has a right to privacy, right? And even if you're in a one-party state or whatever, do I have the right to play these voice memos? And I felt like it was my responsibility, because if somebody positions themselves as this public figure, right, and they are possibly committing a crime, in this case, it's harassment and all kinds of other things, I feel like it was my responsibility outweighed her need for privacy and that concern. But I did check with my attorney. I'm not a complete moron. I checked with my attorney, and he advised me, he's like, this, you went too far. That's not relevant. This is, and so I think that I looked at all those voice memos, listened to them very carefully, and I just felt like it was important for the listeners to hear it. Otherwise, there's no story.
So I just want to say, I'm like a very weird person. I don't binge things. I don't like to binge things. In fact, there are series that I have never seen the end of because I don't want to get to the end of it. And once I watch the last, I've got 2 episodes of Justified left that I've never watched. Because once I watch them, I'm done with it, and I don't want to do that. So I never binge anything. Right. I was absolutely riveted by your podcast. Man, if you haven't heard Pretend, if you haven't heard Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey, I joined the Patreon so I could get things early and I get the bonus stuff. I mean, I was just completely taken with it. Wow. So just from me, anti-binger, if you're going on a long road trip and you're looking for something to listen to, this is the podcast, because you will not sleep until you finish it. It is amazing. And I enjoyed it so much, and I'm glad you did it. I'm looking forward to listening to all your back catalog stuff as well. And I'm just very thrilled that you gave us some of your time to talk about this podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on. This was my pleasure. I've heard about you guys. I've been wanting to collaborate at some point. So this is awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, guys, you heard from the man himself. Now go check out his podcast right away. The Pretend Podcast, latest season, Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey. Javier, thank you for joining us today. We hope to maybe collaborate again soon. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And I'm Javier.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Actually, so the LaDonna series was the less scary of the options. So I had these 2 series at the same time, and I'm thinking, and they're both done, by the way. And I was thinking, they were both done at I had the LaDonna one, I had this other one, and I'm like, oh, the LaDonna one is less scary. So the next one that I'm doing, and I'm actually going to pad it. I'm going to have some stuff in between because I want some palate cleanser episodes to just get rid of the negativity, because this next one's really dark. It's about sextortion, and these women in Nebraska have been targeted by this one person.